if Russia is allowed to break the taboo, which has really been maintained since 1945 in Europe, that you cannot invade your neighbor and steal their land in an imperialist, colonialist way that Russia is doing now, if that taboo is broken, then the whole world faces a Pandora's box of conflicts.
Leigh, there were concerns that fatigue would fit in terms of the West's support to Ukraine. We're now kind of 2 years on in the conflict. We're hearing reports from the front line that promised ammunition isn't getting through, that there's not enough kit that's being supplied, that there's fatigue within the Ukrainian armed forces themselves. They may have to do more in terms of a draft for troops. Is this a real kind of inflection point in terms of the conflict?
Ruth, it's a grim anniversary. 2 years into this war, we've had hundreds of thousands of people killed and permanently disabled on each side. More soldiers on the Russian side, and of course, thousands of civilians on the Ukrainian side. And the war is raging on intensively in the east and south of Ukraine. Naturally, after 2 years, despite the intensity of the war and the intensity of the suffering in Ukraine that continues day by day, the rest of the world is beginning to lose interest. There is a kind of Ukraine fatigue creeping in because other things happen in the world. We have the war in Gaza. We have other things going on in our lives. And the result of that is that the Ukrainians are seeing support from Western countries, in particular from the United States, begin to wane. In the US, the Ukraine support mechanisms, particularly of weapons, but also financial support, have got caught up in domestic politics, unfortunately, with an election coming up later this year. And that is, as you say, Ruth, having an effect on the front line, meaning that Russia, in the last couple of months, has begun to advance again. And that is extremely dangerous for our security here in the United Kingdom, for the security of the United States as well, and of course for all other European countries if Russia is allowed to win this war.
Now, one of the rationales that Russia used for the initial invasion was the closeness of Ukraine to joining NATO, and there was a NATO conspiracy about being a threat to Russia and being on its border. So we can't really divorce the war fighting from the diplomacy. Ukraine desperately, particularly now more than before the war, wants to join European institutions like the EU, like NATO. Is there an argument that actually, if we are true allies and friends, we should be opening up these routes even faster?
We certainly should be opening up those routes. It's worth looking a little bit at history, if I may, Ruth, because back in 2000 and 2002, there was talk of even Russia joining NATO. Russia expressed an interest, and NATO said, well, if you'd like to apply, please feel free. Russia never did apply. But NATO was open to that. NATO was in no way hostile to Russia. It's never been hostile to Russia. It's a defensive alliance. And in 2008, Ukraine did apply to join NATO. And some countries, such as the United Kingdom and the US and the countries of Eastern Europe that suffered most under the Soviet Union, were in favor of allowing Ukraine to join NATO then, back in 2008. But some other countries, notably France and Germany, said, we better mind out, we mustn't provoke Russia. And so the Ukrainian application was frozen. There's never been any chance of Ukraine joining NATO since 2008, since that application was frozen. And then again, in 2014, the result of trying not to provoke Russia was that Russia invaded Crimea and eastern Ukraine, killing around 14,000 people in the following 8 years. Now, in 2016, this argument came again. I was actually in Vienna as ambassador, and I had a visitor who was none other than Boris Johnson, Foreign Secretary. And over a late night nightcap, we discussed Crimea and we discussed what was happening in Ukraine. And Boris Johnson said to me, what should we do? And I argued, as somebody who'd been ambassador in Ukraine and somebody who'd served in the embassy, in the British embassy in Moscow, I said the only language that Russia understands is military force. So if we want to stop Russia invading Ukraine again in the future, we need to arm it to the teeth. And unfortunately, the Foreign Secretary, Boris Johnson, at that time, and indeed many others, he wasn't alone in this, said, well, you know, we must be careful not to provoke Russia. If we give powerful weapons to Ukraine, that'll be seen as provocative. And of course, the result, again, of that was that our attempts to not provoke Russia led to Russia invading again in 2022, this time in a conflict that has killed hundreds of thousands of people, a huge, massive conflict of the type we haven't seen in Europe since 1945. So I do think that the time is right to accelerate Ukraine's NATO membership. I also think it's right to accelerate Ukraine's European Union membership. European Union is, of course, not a military alliance, significantly, but at the same time, allowing Ukraine to gain access to European Union markets and to become more integrated with the European Union sends a huge, strong political signal of support for Ukraine that makes it more difficult for Russia to achieve its war aims.
Yeah, in terms of these large international groupings, I mean, NATO is right at the forefront because it is that defensive shield where you will act if one of your allies is invaded. Their Secretary General, their leader is up for renewal at the moment, and it strikes me, I feel, as quite odd that kind of all the big groupings, Germany, UK, US, seem to be aligning behind the Dutch former Prime Minister Mark Rutte, um, to take over from the Norwegian current head, rather than one of the potential challengers, which is from an area that is directly under that sphere of concern or threat from Russia in terms of the Prime Minister of Estonia. Prime Minister Kallas. I mean, it seems to me that actually a very strong message would be to have an Eastern European head of NATO that was in one of these kind of former Warsaw Pact countries.
I honestly, I don't have a strong view on who should lead NATO next. I'm sure that both the Dutch candidate and the Estonian candidate, or any other candidate who may come forward, will be chosen on the basis of who is the best person for the job. And it's vital that NATO has a strong leader at a time when it is facing existential challenges to our security. The reason this matters so much, if I may say, is that, firstly, if Russia is allowed to win in Ukraine, even to the extent of keeping the land about the size of England that it's seized so far from Ukraine, if it's allowed to keep that land, then they won't stop there. We've seen it already in 2014, where they took about 7% of Ukraine, again, an area maybe a bit bigger than Wales or Scotland, and there was not enough reaction from the rest of the world. The Russians sat on that land for 8 years and then they invaded again. And that's the first reason. Russia will not stop its aggression unless it is defeated in this war. And then the second reason is that if Russia is allowed to break the taboo, which has really been maintained since 1945 in Europe, that you cannot invade your neighbor and steal their land in an imperialist, colonialist way that Russia is doing now, if that taboo is broken, then the whole world faces a Pandora's box of conflicts. We've already seen this actually in South America, where suddenly Guyana, after 100 years of relative security, is being threatened by Venezuela, its neighbor, which claims that 2/3 or 3/4 of Guyana belongs to it, a huge tract of land. And these principles really matter for our security. To defend Ukraine is expensive, but if we don't defend Ukraine, it will be immeasurably more expensive. I don't want to say 10 times or 100 times more expensive, but it will be much more expensive to defend our countries if Ukraine loses this war.